Hey guys, it's Becca. So I have 1 week left for my Adobe grant project, but I just finished the Alex Wu gesture drawing class earlier this week, and I wanted to make a video about it before I forgot everything. So for those of you who are not familiar with Schoolism, Schoolism is an online educational resource. They have specialized classes for both digital and traditional artists. And there's two things that kind of stand out in my mind that make Schoolism pretty special and the reason that I chose this particular course. Number one is that almost all of the Schoolism classes are targeted at people who already have a pretty high proficiency. I have been drawing for 4 years now. 4 years now. Anyway, this is my first time attempting a Schoolism class because it was the first time I felt like my skill level was at a point that I was going to get something out of the class and it wasn't going to, totally just go over my head. And the second thing about Schoolism is that they have very, very specialized courses. And for me, this is really important because I have found throughout my art journey that the classes and the projects that have really given me like a lasting sense of knowledge and something that I continue to use tended to be classes where I got very, very deeply involved on a very narrow topic. I have found for me that sort of wading in the shallows of a lot of different topics hasn't really had as much impact as being really focused on one particular thing and studying that one particular area you want to improve in. So for example, when I did the Watts portrait classes, like very specific, very specialized, and that stuff is like really, really cemented in my brain right now. Also, Drawbox is a good example of a very particular class. I mean, it's not even about perspective, it's a class to learn how to draw individual objects in space. And it took a long time and a lot of effort, but I feel like the things that I learned through these specialized classes tend to have a bigger impact than sort of more general, shallow type courses. The class that I'm talking about is Alex Wu's gesture drawing class, and I did the monthly subscription, which is only $30 a month, and it took me, I worked through very slowly, and it took me about a month and a half. They also offer like fully live critique classes where you get a critique from the teacher. They are very expensive. They cost about $1,000, so maybe someday. But for now, I felt like it was a really good deal for $30 a month to have access to these really prestigious and well-known teachers. And after going through the course, they're well thought out. They're very thorough. They do a good job making sure that the course is structured in a good way. So it's a great value in my opinion. So I've already covered lessons 1 through 3 in another video. I'll put links in the description below for those. Today I'm going to cover lessons 4 through 7, which is the rest of the class. So lesson 4 is about space and how you can use the ground plane and perspective to show that your character or your drawing exists in a three-dimensional world. And to get going, I'm going to show you several of my drawings, which are examples of exactly what not to do to show space in a drawing and to show that a figure exists in 3D space. So if you're looking at these, what they all have in common is one thing, and it's that they look like they're awkwardly standing on a tightrope. Not good. So that was my main challenge with this lesson, is that I have this habit, this compulsion to draw all my characters like they are existing exactly on one flat line. The first session I went really slowly, and you can see that because the drawings look very tidy and kind of like a little bit too tight for a gesture drawing. And that was because I was just really trying to fight that urge to really flatten out the figure. So it took me a while to get a hang of it, but I did eventually sort of wrap my head around how I could adjust the limbs and the body so that it looked more three-dimensional. And as if this exercise was not hard enough, the added twist is that you had to do half of them with your non-dominant hand. And I actually think that my left-handed drawings are way cooler and kind of like more, interesting looking than my right-handed one. But in general, this is a really great lesson, and I can totally see how much more convincing these poses are now that I'm thinking about making sure that my figures are existing on a ground plane that has some depth to it. Lesson 5 is about exaggeration, and it's not about exaggerating the shape, which I think is what we tend to think about when we do gesture drawing, but we actually already covered that in lesson 2 and 3. So when he's talking about exaggeration in this lesson, he's talking about exaggerating the idea of the pose or the mood of the pose or the story that it's communicating. This is a very hard thing to do because a lot of times it requires you to completely change the pose. So if you see something and you think, oh, this person is communicating something, a lot of times you're going to have to change the positioning, change the arms, change the angle. And that means you have to draw from imagination, and I'm not really great at drawing quickly from my imagination. So these were definitely difficult and maybe not the most successful drawings that I've done throughout the course. I will say though that just the idea of thinking about a narrative when you go to draw from a reference is something that's never actually really crossed my mind before. Like for example, if I go to a figure drawing session, I just draw what the person's doing. Like they do a pose, I draw the pose, and maybe I'll exaggerate the pose, but I won't come at it like the pose is somehow telling a story. And I can see how this idea could really make your figure drawing much more impactful and have more meaning if you are sort of creating your own underlying narrative with it. So I can see that the idea and the messaging from this lesson could be really useful for me moving forward. Lesson 6 is about extrapolation, and to prepare for this lesson we had to pick an animal and study the anatomy of it. So I picked a ferret. Why, you may ask? So the main exercise of this lesson is to extrapolate from a photo of a human and use the idea or the essence of that person's pose and apply it to an animal and have that animal communicate the same thing the person is doing. My first attempt at this exercise was not very successful, and I realized this because one nice thing about Schoolism is that you can go in and watch all of the critiques from past participants in the live class. So I realized very quickly that the characters that I were doing, or the ferrets that I were doing, were too anthropomorphized. They look sort of like a man in a ferret suit, which is not what you're supposed to be doing with this one. You're supposed to be showing a ferret which embodies the idea from the photo. But what I was doing was basically just posing a ferret in the same pose that the person was doing. But I think the second 2 pages here are way better. The anatomy feels more realistic and it still has that communication of the idea from the photo, but it's not quite so like weird man in a ferret suit. So lesson 7 was the final lesson and it was definitely the most fun. This lesson was about story, and with this one I could really see all of the different lessons coming together and how much I had improved through putting together all of these disparate pieces. For this exercise, we had to tell a story based on a reference photo. But what was really fun about it was that we had a series of photos, and each drawing that we made, each story, had to continue from the previous one. So in the first one, we developed a character, we developed a dynamic, and then each of the subsequent drawings had to tell more of the story based on a photo of a completely different person, unrelated to the story that we were creating. So this was a big challenge because you, of course, have the story part, the narrative piece, where you have to think about how these different images are going to connect to each other, but you also have the technical piece that requires that you extrapolate from a photo and apply it to a totally different character. And also, you know, I had to create multiple characters and they all have to exist in the same space, in the same perspective. So this was really, really, truly a lot of different challenging elements working together. So my first story is about this kind of rebellious teenage girl who's always getting into trouble and doing what her parents don't like, you know, just normal teenage girl stuff. And the next one was about a toddler who's also kind of doing all these mischievous things. I struggled to get the character consistent in this one, and it was definitely more difficult to extrapolate the essence of the pose from an adult woman to a toddler. But I think in the end, once I kind of polished everything up, they tell a pretty consistent story and convey a consistent character. And that was the last lesson, you guys. I loved this course. I would suggest it to anybody who's interested in really pushing their storytelling and the narrative that they can provide through their character. I've actually seen a huge improvement already in my character drawings and my character designs, so it has already paid off for sure. If anybody has any questions about it, ask me in the comments. I will answer them as well as I can, and otherwise I will see you guys next week.